We may learn a lot about the scientific method, but why do we have to use it all the time? For example, let's say we are curious about a particular inquiry question. We want to know if the grass is truly greener on the other side. Now, we could simply do this experiment by using our eyes and looking at the other side of the lawn on one side of the fence versus the other, and we can simply observe, yeah, it seems like the grass is truly greener on one side versus the other. Why report all the specific details? Why report the specific things that we did? We know what we saw. Why can't we just leave it there? Is it okay to just leave it there? Well, the short answer is no. But the long answer has to do with the history of the scientific method. Now, the scientific method comes from, let's say, humble origins. And believe it or not, there was once a time where science was actually based not purely, but generally on the principles of subjectivity and bias, which sounds very odd and hard to believe. In fact, you could use enough assertion to prove to someone, or at least convince someone, that you could even turn lead into gold. But in around 300 BC, a lot of people point towards Aristotle and Herophilus as the starts or the origins of what we call the scientific method, which is where we started introducing more objectivity and less bias in the ways we were conducting research. And the scientific method has been refined and popularized by other famous researchers such as René Descartes and also Sir Francis Bacon. But even at that point, there was still more growth and still more development to be helped. One of the most interesting things that happened afterwards was that science became more data-driven. And by this I mean a lot of individuals started using controls. A lot of individuals started to do more analysis and get lots of numbers and comparisons between different kinds of groups. For example, one lawn that contains some kind of fertilizer and one lawn that was a control, no fertilizer. And this was also the beginnings of things like inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is basically when you look at one experiment and you try to make generalizations out of it. So let's say, for example, you wanted to know if all apples can float. So what you do in your experiment is you take 5 apples and you notice that 5 out of 5 apples float. And then you can conclude, well, since my experiment said that 5 out of 5 apples float, probably all apples float. And since then, science has taken off and more things have been added to it. For example, when we look at science, we introduce things like generalizability. We introduce things such as repeatability, as in I saw with my own eyes that the lawn is greener on one side, but will other people see the same thing? And we also like to make sure that within our science that we are having many replicates. In that, if I just look at one lawn, wouldn't I be more confident that the grass is greener on the other side if I looked at 100 lawns? Similarly, with an apple. If I looked at one apple that can float, I'm not sure if every apple floats, but if I looked at 100, perhaps even 1,000 apples, then I could be even more confident about the conclusions that I'm trying to draw. But that doesn't mean that science is perfect and the scientific method is infallible. There's nothing wrong with it because there still are some concerns. For example, there's a lot of things that can still happen, such as bias, within the scientific process. This is really hard to completely eliminate. One such example is something like sampling bias. So this is where a particular sample or a particular group of participants are more likely to be selected. So if I'm trying to evaluate apples and see if they float, what if perhaps I choose only the perfect looking apples and I ignore all the bruised looking apples? And then I notice that all the perfect looking apples will float, so I say all apples float. But hey, I never was able to check with the bruised apples, so who knows what would have happened if I experimented with them. There's another concerning trend as well, in that everyone wants all of their experiments to be perfect all of the time, and they have a fear of failure. But failure in experimentation is actually very valuable. It tells you where you went wrong, it tells you what you can fix, it tells you what changes to make to your protocol to perhaps get better results in the future, so that you can optimize, alter, and then get to your end goal. So what I'm trying to say is that the history of the scientific method is rich, it's deep, it's come a long way. But even when it comes to things like failure, the beauty of the scientific method does not come from having constant successes. The beauty of the scientific method is in its communication, in which you even communicate your failures, because that's the way you get better kinds of information sharing. Different people can work off of each other's work, and hopefully we get faster innovation. So don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of recording every single thing you do within the scientific method, because the beauty of it is in the path and the reliability to making sure you get great scientific results. Thanks for watching.